Picture this. It's a Tuesday in March, 1998. Not a dramatic night. Not a stormy, cinematic night with lightning cracking across the sky and wind howling through the trees. Just an ordinary Tuesday in early spring. The kind of night where the last of the winter's snow is still sitting in dirty gray piles at the edges of parking lots, slowly surrendering to temperatures that haven't quite decided whether they're done being cold yet. The kind of night where nothing is supposed to happen. Gary Hartwick kissed his wife goodbye at 6:47 in the evening. She remembers the exact time because she glanced at the clock on the microwave as he walked toward the door. 6:47. She was finishing the dishes. Their youngest was doing homework at the kitchen table. Their oldest was upstairs, probably on the phone the way teenagers always are. The dog was asleep in its spot by the back door. Everything was exactly the way everything always was on an ordinary Tuesday evening, in an ordinary house, in an ordinary town in rural Wisconsin. Gary told her he'd be back by midnight. He had a short run, nothing complicated. A familiar route. He had driven dozens of times before, over roads he knew the way most people know the layout of their own house. In the dark, half asleep, he could have driven that route. He'd done it that way before, almost. He grabbed his jacket, said something to the kid at the kitchen table. Something small and forgettable the way the things we say in passing always are, the things that only become significant afterward. Only become things we replay obsessively once we understand that they were the last things. He walked out the door, and that was it. That was the last time Linda Hartwick saw her husband. That was the last time his children saw their father. That was the last moment of the before, after which everything became the after, though none of them knew it yet. None of them had any reason to know it. He was just going to work. He was just doing the thing he did. He was coming back by midnight. Midnight came, and he wasn't back. Linda did what people do when someone is a little late. She waited. She watched television without watching it. She checked her phone. She told herself the things you tell yourself. He probably stopped for coffee. He probably ran into some traffic somewhere. He's fine. He's always fine. He knows those roads better than anyone. 1 a.m. Now the television was off, and she was just sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold, staring at the door, listening for the sound of his truck in the driveway. 2 a.m. She called his cell phone. It rang through to voicemail. She left a message that tried to sound casual and almost succeeded. 3 a.m. She called his dispatcher. The dispatcher hadn't heard from Gary since he'd checked in at the start of his run earlier that evening. Everything had been normal. He'd sounded fine. Normal. Just Gary doing what Gary did. By the time the sun came up on Wednesday morning, Linda Hartwick knew something was wrong. Not suspected. Not worried. Knew. The way you know things in your body before you know them in your mind. The way a cold certainty settles into your chest and sits there like a stone and refuses to move no matter how many rational explanations you try to stack on top of it. Something had happened to her husband. She called the police, and the search for Gary Hartwick began. It would last, in various forms, for the next 14 years. It would involve law enforcement from 3 counties. It would involve private investigators hired with money the family didn't really have. It would involve search parties and tip lines and renewed media coverage every few years when someone decided the anniversary of his disappearance was worth a story. It would involve Linda Hartwick making phone calls and attending meetings and refusing to let the case go cold for over a decade. It would involve her children growing up with a question mark where their father should have been. And it would end, finally, shockingly, in a way that nobody expected and everybody should have, on a gray autumn morning in 2012, when a volunteer dive team lowered sonar equipment into a lake 12 miles from the road Gary Hartwick had been traveling that Tuesday night, and found his truck sitting on the bottom. 14 years, 12 miles, 23 feet of water. That's how close the answer had been the entire time. That's how long the lake had kept its secret. But before we go to that lake, before we go down into that dark water with those divers and watch the sonar screen paint the shape of something that should never been there, we need to understand the full weight of what 14 years without answers actually does to family, to a woman, to children, to a community that knew Gary Hartwick and watched the people who loved him carry an impossible weight for over a decade. Because this story is about more than a missing truck driver. It's about more than a lake and a sonar ping and a volunteer dive team. It's about what it costs a family to live in the space between knowing and not knowing. For years, for over a decade, for the entirety of their children's childhoods. It's about what we owe each other when someone disappears. And it's about what happens when someone finally decides that the answer is worth finding, no matter how long it takes or how deep you have to go to find it. Stay with me, because this story goes deep. In every sense of the word, before Gary Hartwick became a mystery, he was a man, and I need you to hold on to that. I need that to be the thing you carry with you through this entire story, because it's easy, dangerously easy, to let the mystery swallow the man, to let the cold case file become more real than the person it represents. To forget that behind every unsolved disappearance is a human being who had a favorite meal and a laugh that people can still describe in detail, and habits that drove his family mildly crazy in moments of unexpected tenderness that the people who loved him never forgot. Gary Hartwick was all of those things. He was 44 years old when he disappeared. Born and raised in the part of Wisconsin that doesn't make it onto postcards, not the dramatic loch shores or the famous cheese country or the tourist-friendly parts of the state, but the interior, the working part, the part where the economy runs on agriculture and manufacturing, and the kind of industries that require people who show up reliably, work hard, and don't make a fuss about it. Gary fit that world like he was made for it, because in many ways he was. His father had worked with his hands. His grandfather, too. There was a lineage of physical labor in the Hartwick family that Gary carried forward not as obligation, but as identity. He was proud of it, proud of the kind of work that leaves calluses on your palms and a specific kind of tiredness at the end of the day that feels earned in a way that no other kind of tiredness does. He found trucking in his mid-20s, tried a few other things first, construction for a couple years, a stint at a manufacturing plant outside of town, but the road called him in a way those other jobs never quite did. There was something about the combination of solitude and purpose that suited his particular temperament. Long hours, your own company, a destination that mattered, a job that was measurable in miles and deliveries and arrivals, not in abstract quarterly metrics or performance reviews. He was good at it. He was the kind of driver that dispatchers loved because he was reliable in a profession where reliability is genuinely rare. He didn't complain. He didn't cut corners. He didn't push past his limits in ways that created safety problems. He was professional in the way that people who take a quiet pride in their work are professional, without needing anyone to make a fuss about it. His co-workers at the trucking company described him with the kind of consistent warmth that tells you something real about a person, not the generic niceness that people sometimes perform when they're talking about the missing. Real warmth, specific warmth, the kind that comes with actual memories attached. He was funny, people said, not in a showy way, in a dry, understated way that could catch you off guard. He'd say something so deadpan that you weren't sure he was joking until the corner of his mouth moved, just slightly, and then you'd laugh harder because you'd been waiting for it. He was the kind of person who remembered things, not important things necessarily, small things. He'd remember that your kid had a soccer tournament last weekend, and he'd ask how it went, and he'd actually listen to the answer. He'd remember that you took your coffee a certain way and have it ready before you asked. Small attentions, the kind that add up over time into the feeling of being genuinely seen by another person. That was Gary Hartwick. At home, he was different in the way that people who are performing all day are different when they finally get to stop. Not a different person, just a quieter version of the same person. He unwound around his family in a way he didn't unwind anywhere else. The dry humor was still there, maybe sharper at the kitchen table than anywhere else. But the performance, the professional competence, the reliable colleague, all of that dropped away at home, and what was left was just a man who loved his family in a straightforward, undemonstrative, completely genuine way. Linda will tell you, has told anyone who would listen, over the years, in the interviews and the missing persons advocacy work and the long conversations with investigators, that the thing she misses most isn't the big things. It's not the anniversaries or the holidays or the milestone moments, though she misses those too with a specific, stabbing grief. It's the ordinary things. The way he'd come in for a run and immediately start telling her something he'd seen on the road, some small absurd thing, before he'd even taken his jacket off. The way he'd fall asleep on the couch on Saturday afternoons with the TV on and one of the kids using him as a pillow. The way the house felt different when he was in it versus when he wasn't. The way the house felt different. That's the thing she kept coming back to. For 14 years, the house felt different. Wrong. Like a room with a piece of furniture, missing that you keep reaching for, and finding only air. His children were 8 and 13 when he disappeared. Think about that. 8 and 13. Old enough to understand that something terrible had happened. Old enough to feel the absence as a constant, specific weight. Young enough that their entire adolescence, all of it, every year of growing up and becoming people, happened in the shadow of not knowing. The 13-year-old, a girl named Cassie, was in that particular tender moment of adolescence where fathers matter enormously even when their daughters pretend they don't. That developmental window when a girl is figuring out who she is and what the world is and where she stands in it. And the presence of a safe, reliable, loving father is one of the things that helps that process go right. Gary's absence during those years left a mark on Cassie that she has spoken about publicly with a frankness and courage that is humbling to hear. The way she spent her teenage years angry at everything, at nothing, at the unresolvable situation, before the anger softened into something more complex. The way she carried the question of her father into her relationships, her choices, her understanding of what it meant to trust someone who might not come back. The 8-year-old, a boy named Marcus, was young enough that his memories of his father are incomplete in a way that has its own particular grief. He has flashes, images, the feeling of certain things more than the content of them. He grew up building a father partly from family stories, from photographs, from the way his mother talked about Gary. Carefully, lovingly, always present tense even when present tense stopped making sense. For 14 years, Linda Hartwick held that family together, worked, raised 2 children, kept the mortgage paid and the lights on, and the day-to-day machinery of family life functioning. Did all of it with the permanent background weight of not knowing where her husband was or what had happened to him. People ask, sometimes, how she managed, and her answer is always the same. What choice did I have? The kids needed a mother. The bills needed paying. Life needed living. You don't get to stop just because something unbearable has happened. You get up every morning and you keep going and you do the things that need to be done and you carry what you're carrying and you don't put it down because there's nowhere to put it. You just keep going. For 14 years, Linda Hartwick kept going and she never stopped looking for her husband. Not for a single year. Not for a single month. Even when the active investigation slowed to a crawl and the tips dried up and the case file gathered dust in a drawer somewhere, Linda was still making calls, still asking questions, still holding the case open by sheer force of will and love, and the refusal to accept that the answer was unknowable. She was right to refuse, because the answer was out there. It was in the lake. It had been in the lake the whole time. But we're not there yet. Before we get to the lake and the divers and the morning that changed everything, we need to spend some time in the years between, in the investigation, in the long, grinding, heartbreaking process of looking for someone and finding nothing. Because you can't understand what the discovery meant without understanding what the searching cost. And the searching cost everything. The first 48 hours of a missing persons investigation are the most critical. Every law enforcement professional will tell you this. Every forensic expert, every criminologist who has studied the statistics of how missing persons cases resolve or fail to resolve. The first 2 days are when evidence is freshest, memories are sharpest, trails are still warm. The first 2 days are when the probability of finding someone alive drops precipitously with every hour that passes. In Gary Hartwick's case, those first 48 hours produced nothing, nothing useful, nothing actionable. Nothing that pointed in any clear direction at all. Law enforcement responded quickly when Linda reported him missing on Wednesday morning. The local sheriff's department took the report seriously, which is not always the case with missing adults in the initial hours when voluntary departure is considered a real possibility. But something about the specifics of Gary's situation, the short familiar run, the check-in that had been normal, the absolute inconsistency of a disappearance with everything anyone knew about this man, convinced the responding officers that this was not a man who had chosen to walk away from his life. This was a man who was missing. A search was organized. The route Gary had been traveling that Tuesday night was canvassed thoroughly. Every road, every turnoff, every driveway and access road and farm track that branched off from his known path was checked. Deputies drove it in both directions in daylight, which was something they hadn't had during the initial overnight hours. They looked for anything out of place, any sign of a vehicle having left the road, any physical disturbance that might indicate an accident or an incident. They found nothing. No skid marks, no broken vegetation at the road's edge, no gouged earth, no debris, no tire tracks heading somewhere they shouldn't. The road gave up nothing. The fields on either side of it gave up nothing. Gary's cell phone, which would have been the obvious first technical tool for investigators in 1998, had gone dark somewhere on his route. The last ping put it in an area consistent with his known path. But cell tower coverage in that part of rural Wisconsin in 1998 was patchy enough that the location data was far less precise than it would be today. It narrowed a search area rather than identifying a specific location. It wasn't enough. Investigators talked to everyone along the route. Farmers who lived on the roads Gary would have traveled, employees at the truck stops and diners along the way. Anyone who might have been up late on a Tuesday night and might have seen something. A vehicle, headlights, anything unusual. A couple of people thought they might have seen a truck matching Gary's description at various points during that evening. But the sightings were vague, uncertain, inconsistent in ways that made them difficult to build anything on. Nobody had seen anything that clearly indicated trouble. Nobody had seen anything they recognized at the time as significant. Because here's the thing about accidents that happen in the dark on quiet roads in rural areas. Unless someone happens to be watching at that exact moment, unless a set of human eyes is actually pointed in the right direction when the thing happens, they happen invisibly. The road doesn't call for help. The surrounding fields don't raise an alarm. The darkness just absorbs what happens in it and closes back over, and in the morning everything looks exactly the same as it always did. The first week of the investigation produced a lot of activity and no answers. The second week produced less activity. The third week, the investigation was still technically active, but the initial surge of resources was beginning to redistribute toward other demands. This is the reality of law enforcement in smaller jurisdictions. Limited staff, competing priorities. A case with no leads is harder to justify devoting extensive hours to when other cases with actual evidence and actual suspects are pressing for attention. This is not negligence. It's not indifference. It's resource allocation under constraint. But for a family waiting for answers, it feels like abandonment. Linda Hartwick remembers the shift. The way phone calls from investigators became less frequent, and then infrequent, and then occasional. The way meetings that had been weekly became monthly, and then stopped being scheduled at all. The way the energy around the case changed from urgent and active to something quieter and more resigned. She pushed back. She pushed back hard and consistently, and without apology. She called. She showed up. She asked questions and demanded answers, and refused to let the case become something that people had quietly decided wasn't worth pursuing anymore. She was not difficult in the way that word is sometimes used disparagingly about people who are simply demanding what they deserve. She was persistent. She was focused. She was a woman who understood that if she didn't keep the case alive, nobody else was going to do it for her. Private investigators entered the picture in the second year. This is a familiar pattern in missing persons cases where the official investigation stalls. Families who have the means do what they can, hiring professionals to work the case when the official system has effectively stopped doing so. The Hartwicks didn't have a lot of money. Linda had gone back to work full-time after Gary disappeared, navigating the impossible logistics of being a single working mother of 2 children in a community that was sympathetic but couldn't solve the problem for her. Paying a private investigator was a financial sacrifice. She made it anyway. The private investigators pursued some leads that the original investigation had either overlooked or deprioritized. They talked to people who hadn't been on the original witness list. They re-examined the route with fresh eyes and a different set of assumptions. They looked at Gary's professional and personal circumstances in more detail than the initial investigation had, exploring whether there was anything in his life, any conflict, any relationship, any circumstance that might point toward an explanation. They found some things worth knowing. They found nothing that explained where Gary was. The years accumulated. Year 3, Year 5, Year 7. The children were growing up. Cassie went through high school, carrying the weight of her father's disappearance, like a secret she couldn't quite decide whether to share with new people in her life. Marcus became the kid who was known, in the quiet way of small communities where everybody knows everything eventually, as the boy whose dad had disappeared. That was part of his identity before he was old enough to have much say in it. Linda continued making calls, continued following up, continued appearing at meetings with law enforcement every time the case was nominally reopened or whenever new technology promised new possibilities. Because technology was changing. The tools available for cold case investigation were evolving through the late 1990s and into the 2000s in ways that genuinely opened up possibilities that hadn't existed before. DNA analysis was becoming more sophisticated. Digital records were becoming more searchable. And underwater search technology, specifically the side-scan sonar systems that could map lake and river bottoms with meaningful precision, was becoming more accessible to organizations outside of professional salvage or military applications. Linda Hartwick heard about this. She was the kind of person who stayed informed about developments in search technology, because staying informed was part of how she kept herself functional, part of how she maintained a feeling of agency in a situation that was fundamentally characterized by her lack of it. She started asking questions about underwater searches. Because here's the thing she had always known, in a quiet and persistent way that she couldn't quite explain rationally, was worth paying attention to. Gary's route that Tuesday night had taken him past water. Not dramatically, not over a famous bridge or along a famous lake shore, just past the ordinary, unremarkable water that populates rural Wisconsin the way it populates all of the upper Midwest. Quietly, abundantly, without announcing itself. Small lakes, farm ponds, stretches of river visible from the road only if you knew where to look. She had always wondered, had mentioned it to investigators, had been told, gently, that the bodies of water along the route had been checked. But checked how? With what equipment? To what depth? The answers to those questions, when she pressed for them, were less satisfying than she needed them to be. Checked visually, mostly from the surface, from the shore. The kind of checking that would find a vehicle that had entered the water in an obvious, dramatic way, had driven off a bridge, say, or had clearly broken through ice on a visible crossing. The kind of checking that would not find a vehicle that had entered the water quietly, at an angle in the dark, in a place where the entry itself left minimal surface evidence. Linda Hartwick knew this. She understood this. She pushed for an underwater search using sonar equipment. She pushed for years. And eventually, after enough pushing, after enough time, after enough conversations with enough people, she found the right people to help her. She found the divers. And the divers found Gary. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we go to the lake, we need to spend some time with something that doesn't get talked about enough in stories like this. Something that lives in the space between the investigation and the discovery. Something that is less about evidence and more about the impossible daily experience of being the family at the center of an unresolved disappearance. We need to talk about what 14 years actually looks like from the inside. 14 years. I keep coming back to that number because I don't think it's possible to really absorb it without sitting with it for a moment. Not 14 years of something dramatic and visible. Not 14 years of active searching and constant media attention, and the sustained momentum of an investigation going somewhere. 14 years of ordinary life with an extraordinary absence at its center. This is what people don't understand about the families of the missing. They imagine the experience as something continuous and intense, a constant state of crisis, a permanent emergency. And the beginning is like that. The first weeks and months are crisis. They're the frantic energy of a just-launched search, the media attention, the community rallying, the sense that the answer is close and just needs finding. But then the crisis fades. Because crisis is not a sustainable state. Human beings are not built to sustain it indefinitely. The body and the mind adapt, because they have to. And what was crisis becomes something else. Something quieter and more permanent, and in some ways harder to describe. It becomes the background of your life. Linda Hartwick has described it this way. In the first year, she says, you live inside the disappearance. It is the whole room. It fills everything. There is no space in your awareness that isn't occupied by the question of where Gary is and what happened to him and what you need to do next to find out. But you can't live that way forever. You have children who need breakfast, a job that requires your presence, bills and groceries and school pickups and parent-teacher conferences, and all the practical architecture of a life that doesn't pause because your heart is broken and your husband is missing. So over time, the disappearance moves from the center of the room to the corner. It's still there. It never leaves. But you learn to function around it. You learn to make dinner and help with homework and have conversations with neighbors and go through entire stretches of a day without the thought surfacing. And then it surfaces, and the weight of it is still exactly what it always was, unchanged by the hours of apparent normalcy that preceded it. The holidays were the hardest. This is something that families of the missing say so consistently that it's almost a cliche, except that when you hear from a specific person talking about a specific Thanksgiving or a specific Christmas, it stops being a cliche and becomes something that you feel in your chest. The first Christmas after Gary disappeared, Linda put up the tree because the kids needed Christmas to happen. They needed something normal. She put up the tree and hung the ornaments and made the cookies and did all of it with the mechanical, determined care of a person who is holding themselves together through sheer act of will. And at some point in the middle of that Christmas, Cassie, 13 years old enough to understand, young enough to still need her mother to make everything okay, looked at the tree and said, Dad would have put the lights on crooked again. That was it. That was the whole sentence. Crooked lights. But it was everything. Because that's what absence is made of, not the big moments. The small habits, the crooked Christmas lights, the specific ways someone does a specific ordinary thing that you never thought to memorize, because why would you? Because they were always going to be there to do it again next year. Linda Hartwick spent 14 Christmases managing the crooked lights herself. For Cassie, the teenage years were defined by a particular kind of anger that she has since come to understand more clearly than she could at the time. She was angry at the situation, at the not knowing, at the way people at school looked at her, sometimes with that particular mixture of pity and morbid curiosity that teenagers are spectacularly bad at hiding. She was angry at the investigators who didn't find answers. She was angry at whatever force or circumstance or person or accident had taken her father and left her family in this impossible suspension. And she was angry at her father, sometimes, in ways she felt guilty about for years before she understood that this was a completely normal part of grief. Angry at him for not being there. Angry at him for leaving, even though she knew he hadn't chosen to leave. Emotions don't respond to logic. They respond to absence. Marcus, the younger one, had a different experience shaped by his age at the time of the disappearance. His memories of his father were fewer and less complete than Cassie's. His grief was in some ways more abstract. He was grieving a person he hadn't fully known, building a picture of his father from second-hand sources. He grew up knowing Gary Hartwick the way you might know a historical figure, through photographs and stories and other people's memories rather than through his own direct experience. That has its own specific pain. The grief of not having had enough time, of being robbed of years of knowing your own father that you should have had, of reaching adulthood and not being able to draw on a father's example and presence in the ways that shape who a person becomes. He has talked about this, about the way he sometimes wonders who he might have been differently if his father had been present, not in a self-pitying way. He's clear about that. He became who he is. He values who he is. But the wondering is there, honest and real, and it probably always will be. And through all of this, through all 14 years of holidays and milestones and ordinary days and crises large and small, Linda was there, holding the center, working, loving her children, maintaining the investigation by sheer force of personality, and waiting, always waiting, for the phone to ring, for someone to call and say the words she had been waiting to hear for over a decade. We found him. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October of 2012, 14 years and 7 months after Gary Hartwick kissed his wife goodbye at 6:47 in the evening and walked out the door and into the dark and the history of his family forever. The call came, and everything changed, Not every hero wears a uniform. Some of them wear wetsuits. The volunteer dive team that would eventually find Gary Hartwick's truck didn't come together for this case specifically. They had been working for several years before Gary's case came to their attention, building expertise and equipment and reputation in a niche that sits at the intersection of cold case investigation, underwater search technology, and the kind of stubborn civic compassion that drives people to spend their free time doing things that are hard and often heartbreaking, because the alternative, not doing them, is something they can't live with. The team was led, informally and by consensus, by a man I'll call David, not his real name, because he's a private person who never sought the spotlight, even when the spotlight found him. A former commercial diver who had spent years doing underwater work for industrial clients. Inspections, salvage, the unglamorous but highly skilled work of operating effectively in environments where most human beings are simply not equipped to function. At some point, David had started applying those skills to cold cases. He doesn't have a single clean explanation for why. The way he tells it, it started almost accidentally. A local family whose missing relative's car was suspected to be in a river, a sheriff's department that had the suspicion but not the equipment to confirm it, David happening to be in the right conversation at the right time. He went in. He found the car. The family got their answer. And something in the specific, human weight of what it meant to a family to finally know got into him in a way that the industrial work never had. He started looking for more cases. He found other divers who felt the same way. People with skills and equipment and the same inability to walk past an open wound when they had the tools to help close it. The team grew slowly, carefully, because this is not work for people who aren't serious about it. Bad underwater searches are worse than no searches. They create false conclusions, disturb evidence, potentially compromise the integrity of what might become a crime scene. David was meticulous about doing it right or not doing it at all. By 2012, the team had a track record, several solved cases, a reputation in the regional cold case community for professional, careful, effective work, and a waiting list, effectively, of families and investigators who had heard about them and wanted their help. Gary Hartwick's case came to them through Linda. She had been following the team's work for a couple of years before she made contact, had read about them in the context of another case they'd resolved, had researched them carefully, the way she researched everything connected to her husband's disappearance, had decided they were exactly what she had been looking for. She called David. He remembered the conversation later as one of the more striking initial contacts he'd had in this work. Most families who reached out were tentative, careful. They'd been disappointed enough times that they approached new possibilities with guardedness that was completely understandable. They wanted to hope, but were afraid of what hoping again might cost them. Linda wasn't guarded. She was specific. She had a detailed map of the waters along Gary's route. She had a list of lakes and river sections that she believed had not been adequately searched with sonar equipment. She had notes going back years on the original investigation's water search methodology and its limitations. She had done the homework. She knew exactly what she was asking for and why she believed it was likely to produce results. David was struck by that, by the combination of 14 years of grief and 14 years of methodical, focused, never-give-up preparation. By the way those two things had coexisted in this woman, without one destroying the other. He said yes. He said yes because the case deserved it, and because Linda deserved it, and because the chance that the answer was in one of those lakes was real enough to justify the effort. The team began planning the search. They prioritized the bodies of water based on Linda's analysis and their own evaluation of the route Gary had been traveling, the weather conditions at night, the topography of the road, and its surroundings. They were looking for places where a vehicle that left the road under winter conditions could have reached water without leaving obvious surface evidence. They were looking for the quiet entry points, the subtle ones, the ones that a 1998 search conducted primarily by eye and without sonar equipment would have missed. There were several candidates on the list. They started with the ones that seemed most likely based on a combination of route proximity and topography, and worked their way down the list methodically. The third lake on their list was a small, quiet body of water set back slightly from the road, unremarkable from the outside, The kind of lake that locals probably fished without paying much attention to how deep it got in the middle or what the bottom looked like. When the sonar went into that lake on an October morning in 2012, the team found their answer before they covered half the search grid. Because the truck was there. It had been there for 14 years. 23 feet down, settled into the soft lake bottom, absorbed by the silt in a way that all heavy, motionless things are eventually absorbed by soft silt given enough time. It was there. October 2012. The morning is gray in a specific way that Wisconsin mornings in autumn are gray. Not threatening, not stormy. Just overcast in that flat, even way that feels like the sky is conserving itself for something. The team launched the boat early, before most people in the area were awake. This is deliberate. They prefer to work with the surface as calm as possible, which means early morning before wind picks up, and they prefer to work without an audience, which means before the curious show up. The lake was still, completely still. The surface like a gray mirror that reflected the overcast sky back at itself in a way that made the world seem folded. The far shore was visible. This was not a large lake, lined with a particular mixture of oaks and birches that characterized this part of the state. Most of their leaves gone now, the branches bare and dark against the pale sky. The equipment went in. The sonar began its work. David watched the screen with the focused patience of someone who has done this many times. The image building line by line as the boat moved in its first slow pass across the lake. The bottom coming into resolution, silt, weeds, the occasional rock formation, the scattered organic debris of decades of autumn leaves sinking and settling and becoming part of the lake floor. Normal. All of it normal. Second pass. Still normal. Third pass. Slightly overlapping the second, covering the deeper central section of the lake. And then, something. A shape on the screen. That was not the shape of anything natural. Angular where nature is curved. Regular where nature is irregular. Large in a way that took the eye a moment to calibrate, because the scale of it was unexpected in this context. David didn't say anything immediately. He leaned closer to the screen, traced the outline with his eyes, let his brain do the work of identification that it had done in situations like this before. He'd seen this shape before, not this specific image, but this shape. This combination of size and angle, and the specific way something large in metal and manufactured looks when it's been sitting on a lake bottom long enough to be partially absorbed by it. He looked up at the team member beside him. He said quietly, "I think we got something." The boat slowed. They ran the sonar over the anomaly from a second angle, getting a different perspective on the shape, building a more complete picture of what was sitting down there. There was no serious doubt after the second pass. This was a vehicle, a large vehicle, sitting on the bottom of this lake at approximately 23 feet of depth, having apparently been there for a significant period of time based on the degree of sedimentation around and beneath it. The preparations for a dive were made with the careful efficiency of a team that does not rush these moments. Rushing is how mistakes get made. Rushing is how you contaminate a scene or miss something important or put a diver in danger. They checked equipment. They discussed the dive plan. They identified the landmarks that would help the first diver navigate to the target without losing orientation in limited visibility water. And then the first diver went in. The water was cold. October in Wisconsin, a lake that doesn't get significant direct sun. Cold in a way that even a good wetsuit only manages rather than prevents. The kind of cold that sharpens attention in a way that's almost useful as long as you don't let it escalate. The diver descended along the line they'd rigged as a guide to the target location, down through the water that shifted from greenish near the surface to darker and more amber as depth increased and light diminished, past the zone of any useful ambient light into the territory where the dive light was the only thing standing between visibility and complete darkness. The bottom came into view gradually, the silt, pale and fine, stretching out in all directions, the weeds, gone mostly to winter dieback, the remnant stalks standing in the sediment like small skeletal things. And then, out of the murk ahead and slightly to the left, a shape, large, dark, resolving out of the ambient murk into something specific as the diver moved closer and the dive light reached it. A truck, a large commercial truck, Sitting on the bottom of this unremarkable lake in this unremarkable part of Wisconsin, 23 feet below a surface that people had boated and fished and probably ice skated on without any idea what was beneath them. The diver moved around the vehicle slowly and carefully, documenting, noting condition, position, the degree of sedimentation around the wheels and undercarriage, noting the condition of the cab, noting the details that would matter when investigators and forensic specialists got involved, and began the process of determining what had happened here. After a dive of appropriate length, the diver surfaced, climbed back into the boat, removed the mask, looked at David. "It's a truck," the diver said. "Big one. Been there a long time." And on that boat, on that gray October morning, the reality of what they found settled over the team with the specific weight that only this kind of discovery carries. They found Gary Hartwick, 14 years after he drove away on a Tuesday night and didn't come back. He had been here, in this lake, 12 miles from the road where his wife had been searching all this time. 12 miles, 23 feet of water. That was the entire distance between the mystery and its answer. David reached for his phone. He had a call to make. There's a phone call that Linda Hartwick had imagined receiving for 14 years. Not imagined in a morbid way. Or not only in a morbid way. Imagined in the way that people in her situation inevitably do. As the thing that would finally end the waiting. As the moment that would transform the story from one, without an ending, into one with one. As the call that would give her, at whatever cost, the ability to finally know. She had imagined it so many times that she had, in a way, worn a groove in her own imagination shaped exactly like that call. And then one morning in October it actually rang. The real version was different from the imagined version, in almost every way except the fundamental one. It was David. He told her they had found a vehicle in a lake along Gary's route. He told her the vehicle matched the description of Gary's truck. He told her the official investigation would need to be involved before any definitive confirmation could be made, but that he wanted to be the one to call her, because she deserved to know as soon as they knew. He asked her if she was sitting down. She told him she was already sitting. She had been sitting since she saw his number on the screen. She told him later that in the moment the call happened, the first thing she felt was not what she expected. Not relief, not grief, not the dramatic emotional release of a climactic cinematic moment. The first thing she felt was a strange, almost disorienting stillness. Like the room had stopped moving. Like the world had briefly stopped its ordinary noise and motion, and just held itself still around this single, enormous fact. He was in the lake. He had been in the lake. All this time, 12 miles away. The stillness lasted only a few seconds, she said, before the other things came rushing in. The grief, the relief, the complicated tangle of emotions that don't have clean individual names, and that she spent years trying to describe to therapists and journalists and anyone else who asked. She called Cassie first. Cassie, who was in her late 20s by then, who had grown into a woman in the years since her father disappeared, and who had carried the not knowing all the way into adulthood. Cassie didn't say anything for a long time after her mother told her. Just breathed. Just held the phone and breathed, and let the information land wherever it needed to land. Then she said, "Is he okay?" And Linda understood immediately what Cassie meant by that. Even though the question was technically unanswerable, even though Cassie at some level knew the answer, what Cassie meant was he at peace down there? Was he okay in the way we hope the dead are okay? Whatever that means. In whatever way it can mean anything. "I think so," Linda said. "I think he's okay." Marcus was at work when his mother called him. He stepped outside to take the call and stayed outside for a long time after it ended, standing in a parking lot in the October air, letting 14 years reorganize themselves around a piece of information that changed the shape of all of them. He has described the experience as something like vertigo, not metaphorical vertigo, but actual physical vertigo, the feeling that the ground under his feet was briefly uncertain, that the spatial relationship between himself and the world needed to be recalibrated around this new fact. His father had been in a lake for 14 years. While Marcus graduated high school and started working and became a person, his father had been in a lake 12 miles from the road where his mother spent 14 years looking. These are the moments that don't fit into any narrative framework you already have. These are the moments that require construction of an entirely new framework, And that construction takes time. It takes longer than a phone call. It takes longer than a day. It takes, in many cases, years. But the first step in building the new framework is having the facts, having something real and specific and located to build around, having the answer, even if the answer is devastating, even if the answer is a truck at the bottom of a lake. Having the answer is the foundation. Everything else can be built on top of it. When law enforcement took over the site of the lake and began the formal recovery operation, the investigation entered a new phase. Evidence that had been unavailable for 14 years was suddenly, potentially, accessible. The truck itself was physical evidence. The condition of its interior, its mechanical systems, the position of its components, all of it potentially spoke to what had happened on that Tuesday night in 1998. All of it had been preserved in the limited and degraded way that freshwater submersion preserves things. For 14 years, the recovery operation was carefully planned and executed. This was not a situation where the truck could simply be winched out of the water. That would risk destroying evidence. The operation required proper forensic documentation of the vehicle in situ before anything was moved. Divers with forensic training documented everything they could observe underwater. The precise position and orientation of the truck was recorded. The condition of every observable surface and component was documented. And then, with appropriate care, the vehicle was raised. What investigators found when they were able to examine the truck properly was a mixture of expected and the unexpected. Expected. Significant deterioration from 14 years of freshwater submersion, corrosion, biological colonization, degradation of materials that don't hold up well to extended immersion, sediment infiltration, the general reduction in evidential value that time and water produce in any submerged vehicle, no matter how well preserved. Less expected. The degree to which some aspects of the vehicle's condition were informative despite the deterioration. The reconstruction of how the truck had entered the lake was possible to a meaningful degree. The angle of entry, the approximate speed, the specific location of the entry point, all of these could be established with enough confidence to tell a coherent story about the final minutes of Gary Hartwick's last run. What that story told was this. The truck had left the road at a specific point where the road curved gently and the lake came close to the road's edge, close enough that a vehicle that lost a curve, that failed to track with the road as it bent to the right, would travel in a relatively straight line directly toward the water. On a night with the temperature and moisture conditions that were documented for that area on that date, the road surface at that curve would have been problematic, not necessarily obviously icy, not the thick, visible ice that drivers know to watch for, but the thin, nearly transparent glaze of ice that forms when moisture from the day freezes in the evening temperature drop. Black ice, as it's commonly called, the most dangerous kind because it gives no visual warning. A driver encountering that curve at normal road speed, on what looked from the windshield like a wet but navigable road, could have been into the curve before the tires reported the problem to the steering. And by then, on a curve with a lake on the outside and an entry point that close to the water, recovery might have been impossible. This is the reconstruction that the evidence supports. A driver on a familiar route, on a night with treacherous conditions that may not have been visually apparent, hitting a curve at normal speed and discovering too late that the road wasn't what it looked like. It's consistent with an accident, a terrible, specific geography and weather accident that had nothing to do with the character or competence of the man behind the wheel, and everything to do with the particular cruel combination of a specific curve and a specific type of ice on a specific night. Gary Hartwick was not negligent. He was not reckless. He was an experienced, professional driver who encountered conditions that gave him no warning and no time to respond. He had been in that lake, under those conditions, since approximately 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in March of 1998, and nobody had known. The formal identification of the vehicle was confirmed through multiple channels, registration records, physical description matching the reported truck, and other identifying characteristics that remained legible despite 14 years of submersion. Gary Hartwick's physical remains were not recovered intact from the vehicle. Consistent with everything that forensic science tells us about human remains in freshwater over extended periods, what could be found and identified was partial and dispersed. Enough for a formal determination, not enough for a complete picture, but enough Enough for a death certificate. Enough for a formal conclusion to a case that had been open for 14 years. Enough for the Hartwick family to finally have, in the bureaucratic and legal sense, the acknowledgement that Gary was gone. Enough to close the file. Not enough to close the wound. But the wound was different now. The open, uncertain, ongoing wound of not knowing was replaced by something with defined edges. Something that could, in time, be grieved properly and integrated, and eventually, in the way that human beings eventually do, carried forward. The investigation officially concluded that Gary Hartwick's death was a result of an accidental vehicle accident. The truck leaving the road at the curve and entering the lake under winter road conditions consistent with black ice formation. No foul play was indicated. No criminal conduct was found. The conclusion was tragic accident, and the evidence, within its limitations, supported that conclusion. For the Hartwick family, the official conclusion brought a complicated mixture of emotions that Linda has been honest about in the years since. Relief at knowing, at having a story with an ending, even a terrible one. Grief at the confirmation, at the door closing finally and permanently on the verge of the future that included Gary coming home somehow, some way, still alive. A particular, specific, physical grief at the image of him in that lake. At the idea of him being there all that time while they lived and grew and changed and searched and missed him, at the distance between where he was and where they were, measured in miles and fathoms and years. And beneath all of it, something that might be the closest thing to peace that a situation like this can offer. The knowledge of what happened. The ability to say now, to anyone who asks, this is a story of Gary Hartwick. This is a beginning, and the middle, and the end. This is a complete, whole, terribly human story of a man who drove away on a Tuesday night and didn't come home. Not because he chose not to, not because something sinister and unresolved happened to him, but because the road was icy and the curve was sharp and the lake was close and he never had a chance. That's the story. It's a complete story. It's devastating, but it's complete. Closure is a word that gets used carelessly. People say it like it's a door, like something happens, a discovery, a confirmation, a formal conclusion, and the door closes, and on one side of it is the grief, and on the other side is the rest of your life, and you just step through and close it behind you, and that's that. That's not how it works. Linda Hartwick has been clear about this in the years since the discovery, clear in a way that's important and that serves other families in similar situations who need to hear it from someone who has actually lived through it. Closure is not a door. It's a shift, a change in what you're carrying and how you're carrying it. The weight doesn't go away. The grief doesn't go away. Gary doesn't come back because now you know where he went. The 14 years of missing him don't become less real because the question of what happened to him has finally been answered. What changes is the quality of what you're living with. For 14 years, Linda had been living with an open question, an unfinished sentence, a wound that couldn't heal because the conditions for healing weren't present. You cannot grieve fully what you cannot acknowledge as lost. And as long as the story had no ending, she couldn't acknowledge the loss completely. Now she could. And so the grieving that had been partial and complicated and constrained for 14 years by the uncertainty at its center could finally be complete, could finally be the full, real, acknowledged grief of losing the person you loved. Not the grief of not knowing what happened to them. The grief of knowing. The grief that has a shape and a story and an ending that is terrible but real. That's what closure actually is, Linda says. Not the end of grief, the beginning of real grief. The kind you can actually move through instead of circling around endlessly. For Cassie, the discovery and its aftermath were a process that took years to work through. The therapy she'd been doing on and off since her father's disappearance took on a different character after 2012. The work shifted from managing the ambiguity to actually processing the loss. Different work. Harder in some ways. Necessary in ways that the managing the ambiguity work could never be. She talks about her father differently now. Not as a missing person. Not as the subject of an ongoing investigation. Not as the open question that defined her family's life for 14 years. She talks about him as her father. As a specific man who drove a truck and made dry jokes and put the Christmas lights on crooked and walked out a door on a Tuesday night and never came back. She can tell the story now. The complete story. Beginning, middle, end. That matters more than it might sound like it does. For Marcus, the aftermath of the discovery involved a kind of archaeology of the father he had been too young to properly know, with the mystery resolved. He found himself wanting to understand Gary Hartwick as a full person, wanting to gather the memories and stories and descriptions that had always been available, but that he hadn't been quite ready to sit with fully, while the question of what had happened to his father remained open. He spent time with people who had known Gary, co-workers, old friends, the dispatcher who had taken that last check-in call on Tuesday night, and who had been carrying a piece of this weight himself for 14 years. Marcus listened to all of it, let himself build the picture of a father he had lost at 8 years old. Let himself grieve, finally, specifically and completely, for the person rather than just for the absence. He says he feels like he knows his father better now than he did in the years when Gary was missing, which is a strange and painful truth. The resolution of the case gave Marcus permission to pursue knowing who Gary actually was in a way the ongoing mystery had somehow blocked. The community around the Hartwick family responded to the discovery with a particular collective exhale that communities produce when a long unresolved local mystery is finally answered. There was grief, renewed and specific. There was relief. There was a complicated emotion, somewhere between eerie and humbling and sad, of realizing that the answer had been close by all along. People who drove that road in the years after Gary's disappearance found themselves recalibrating their understanding of what had been near them without their knowing. People who had fished that lake, maybe on summer weekends. People who had driven past it in winter, watching the ice form on its surface, without any idea what was under the ice. The lake had looked the same every day for 14 years, and every day it had been holding Gary. That knowledge changes a place, at least for the people who love it and know it. Not permanently, not forever, but it puts something into the landscape that wasn't there before. A presence, a memory, the specific weight of what happened there and how long it stayed hidden. The team of volunteer divers that found Gary Hartwick's truck received, in the aftermath of the discovery, something that David told me was more meaningful than any formal recognition or media coverage. A letter from Linda. He won't share the specifics of what she wrote, and that privacy is appropriate. But he says it sits in a drawer in his home, and that on the days when work feels hard, when a search produces nothing, when the lake bottom offers up only disappointment, when the resources and the energy feel insufficient to the scale of what he's trying to do, he sometimes takes it out and reads it, and then he picks up the sonar equipment, and he gets back in the boat, because there are more lakes, and there are more families, and the answers are in the water somewhere, patient and waiting. They just need someone stubborn enough to go looking. We are at the end now. The end of Gary Hartwick's story. The end of Linda's 14 years of waiting. The end of the mystery that the lake kept for so long and finally, reluctantly, gave up. But the end of a story is always also an opportunity. An opportunity to look back at what you've just heard and ask what it means. Not just what happened. We know what happened now. We know the full shape of it. But what it means, what it tells us about ourselves and our communities, and the way we treat the people who disappear and the families they leave behind. Because every story like this one is trying to tell us something. Every cold case, every family that waited too long, every volunteer dive team that found in a lake what official investigation couldn't find on land. All of it is data. All of it is evidence about the way the world works and where the gaps are and what we could do differently if we decided that doing differently was worth the effort. Here is what I think the story tells us. It tells us that persistence is not optional. It tells us that the difference between a case that gets solved and a case that stays cold forever is often not evidence or technology or luck. It's often one person, sometimes just one person, who refuses to accept that the answer is unknowable, who continues to make calls and ask questions and push against the institutional gravity that pulls unsolved cases toward the back of the drawer. Linda Hartwick was that person for 14 years. She was not a professional investigator. She was not trained in forensics or search methodology. She was a wife and a mother and a person who had been handed a situation she didn't choose and decided that the only acceptable response to it was to keep going, to keep looking, to keep insisting, past all reasonable expectation, that the answer was out there and that it was worth finding. She was right. The second thing the story tells us is about the gap between what official systems can do and what they actually do, not because of bad intentions or institutional indifference, because of resource constraints, because of the sheer volume of need that law enforcement faces, because of the way that cold cases without active leads naturally get deprioritized in favor of cases that are actively generating investigative opportunities. Those gaps are real. They are not going away. And into those gaps step people like David and his dive team, people with skills and equipment and the specific, uncommon willingness to spend their own time on things that are hard and often don't produce results and require you to be ready to sit with the weight of what you find when they do produce results. These people are not anomalies. There are more of them than you might think, across the country, in every region. There are individuals and groups who have decided that the official system isn't enough and that they have something to contribute to filling the gap. Search and rescue volunteers, cold case investigators, forensic genealogists who give their time to identifying the unidentified, and yes, dive teams who go into the dark water, looking for the things that the surface doesn't show. We don't celebrate these people enough. We don't fund them enough. We don't organize around them enough or build the infrastructure that would allow them to be even more effective than they already are. This story is an argument for doing all of those things. The third thing this story tells us is about technology, about the way that tools evolve and what that evolution means for the families of the missing who are waiting for answers that previous technology couldn't provide. The sonar that found Gary Hartwick's truck in 2012 did not exist in any practically accessible form in 1998. The gap between his disappearance and his discovery was not entirely about search effort. Some of it was about the technological gap between what searchers needed and what was available to them. This will always be true to some extent. There will always be cases that current technology can't solve that future technology will. There will always be answers sitting in lakes and rivers and forests and all the other places where the missing end up that current tools can't reach, but future tools will. This is actually, in a strange way, a source of hope. Every case that is cold today, because of technological limitations, is a case that might be solved tomorrow when those limitations no longer exist. Every family that is waiting today because the tools to find their person aren't yet accessible might be receiving a call tomorrow when those tools become accessible and someone with David's disposition decides to use them. The answer might already be there. The technology to find it just hasn't arrived yet. Or in some cases, the team with the right technology just hasn't been pointed at the right lake yet. Either way, keep the cases open. Keep the files active. Don't close things just because today's tools can't solve them, because tomorrow's tools might. The fourth thing the story tells us is about what we owe each other as communities and as human beings, about the compact that exists, implicitly but really, between people who live together and share spaces and share the fundamental vulnerability of being human. Gary Hartwick was a community member. He paid taxes. He drove roads that other people drove. He was part of the social fabric in the way that all of us are part of it, not prominently, not famously, but really in the connected, interdependent way of people who live in the same place and look out for each other's kids and gnaw at each other at the gas station. When he disappeared, the community had a responsibility, not a legal one necessarily, a human one, the responsibility to keep looking, to keep caring, to not let the administrative reality of a case going cold translate into a human reality of a family being abandoned, for the most part, imperfectly, with the limitations of resource and attention that all human communities have. The community around the Hartwicks tried to meet that responsibility. They supported Linda when they could. They kept Gary's name in local conversations. They didn't forget, but forgetting is always a risk. Time creates distance. New things happen. New people arrive in communities who didn't know Gary and have no personal connection to his story. The answer to that risk is not to count on memory alone. It's to build the structures, the advocacy organizations, the cold case teams, the volunteer search groups, the technology accessibility programs that allow communities to keep the cases active even when individual memory fades. Gary Hartwick deserved those structures. His family deserved them. Every family in their situation deserves them. The fifth thing this story tells us is the simplest and the most important. The one I want to leave you with because it's the one that I think can actually change something if enough people hear it and take it seriously. People deserve to be found, not just the famous ones, not just the ones whose cases get national news coverage and documentary treatment, and the sustained attention of well-funded investigations. All of them. Every person who drives away on a Tuesday night and doesn't come back. Every truck driver and store clerk and farmer and teacher, an ordinary human being who leaves behind a family that doesn't know what happened to them. Every one of them deserves to be found. And the finding requires people like David and his team. It requires the Lindas who refuse to give up. It requires the community members who decide that 14 years is not long enough to stop caring. It requires the application of technology that exists to the problem of the missing in a way that our current systems don't reliably produce without individual champions pushing for it. It requires all of us to decide that the missing matter, not abstractly, specifically, not as statistics in a missing persons database, as people, as a specific, irreplaceable, gone too soon people that their families know them to be. Gary Hartwick kissed his wife at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening. He said something small and forgettable to his youngest child. He walked out the door. And for 14 years, the lake kept him, until someone decided to look. Until a team of volunteers with sonar equipment and an inability to walk past an open wound got in a boat on a gray October morning and drove it in parallel lines across a quiet lake and found the shape on a screen that changed everything. Until David picked up his phone and called a woman who had been waiting 14 years for him to call. Until Linda Hartwick finally knew. She knows now. Gary is found. And wherever you are, whoever you are, if you're carrying a story like this one, if you know a family like the Hartwicks, if you have the skills or the resources or just the stubbornness to be part of making sure that more lakes give up their secrets, go look. Keep looking. Don't stop. The answer is out there. It's always been out there. The lake just needs someone willing to go in.